Right. Hi, my name is Nathan Leeds, and I am here today to talk about a Tableau dashboard presentation analyzing some data about the Epic, comparing costs and critics of Epic fantasy series. And yeah, so we'll kind of talk about the main question that I was trying to answer with this data. And that is initially, I was just kind of interested to see why the show The Wheel of Time got canceled and how it compares to other fantasy shows like it. And so initially, I tried to find some data on viewership and budget, but I kind of found that the viewership data was very difficult to find. Like how many millions of people or whatever watched the TV show. That was a little bit tricky to find. I could find it for older shows, but not more recent ones. So I pivoted to analyzing the budget for the show and the critical response. Generally found the averages per season on Metacritic. So first, we'll look at the data set here. So we have it on Excel or Google Sheets. So we have, in the columns, we have the show, then we have the season of the show, and then the Metacritic average for Metacritic essentially makes an average already for you. So um, for other critical reviews, but these are the various different scores that each of these seasons got on Metacritic. And then the budget, this is in millions per season. Okay, so, American Gods, season 3, got a 69 on Metacritic, and then $100 million was the budget for that show. And then the last column over here would be if it's canceled, finished, or ongoing. So American Gods was canceled, and down here, right? So Foundation, we've had 2 seasons of Foundation, ongoing, Game of Thrones, finished, etc. So here are the various different data points of the Tableau dashboard that I'll be going over. So the source of the data, where did I find all this data? A lot of it was through various different sources. So on budget, that was a little bit tricky to find. It's not always published about these shows. Usually it's kind of published as a general number, not the exact. Metacritic scores found on Metacritic. Some of them did not have Metacritic for whatever reason, so I ended up using Rotten Tomatoes for those as a different, you know, but closely related score and then onto the dashboard. So let's take a look at it. All right, so this is the dashboard that I made, and here is the various different numbers that I came up with. So initially, I started looking at just raw numbers. So to compare Rings of Power per se, this one had an average budget. We see it here as 729 million. But then I kind of started to realize maybe that doesn't matter so much what the budget is or so much what the Metacritic score is, but how it relates to the other fantasy shows like it. And so that's why I started kind of comparing them to each other. And so what I started to do is kind of compile, so this section here is the percent away from the median, right? So now I'm comparing it to each other as opposed to just using those raw numbers. I also did percentile of the budget, and then I kind of give the same thing for the Metacritic score. So again, maybe the Metacritic score is not as important, but how does that Metacritic score compare to the other shows in this data set? I felt like that was a more important um, metric because we're comparing them as opposed to just looking at the raw number. I think is a much better, useful thing to do. Um, so that is the dashboard. We have various different things that we can do with it. So the status, right? We can highlight the canceled shows. So these are all the canceled shows in red. Green would be the finished shows. We have blue as ongoing. And then we can also filter by the show. So we can hear all our different shows that we're comparing here. Last Kingdom, right? It can highlight where that is. The one I initially set out to compare, Wheel of Time. There's all the data for that particular show in various different spots. So yeah, so there it is. So we kind of talked about these 4 sections. Again, this is the percent away from the median budget. This is the percentile of the budget. So where the budget lies, right? So this is the 0 percentile. Last Kingdom was the least expensive show. Rings of Power, most expensive show, so 100 percentile. And then same with the Metacritic score, so percent away from the median score for critical reviews, percentile of the Metacritic score. And then the other thing I had is also just the budget for the show. So you can kind of compare those as well down in here. And Rings of Power is off the grid. But yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the findings. So this dashboard does have a pretty good amount of findings that I thought were pretty interesting. I'll go ahead and start with the ongoing status of the shows. So what I found with the ongoing status is that they're generally budget much higher than the rest of the shows, which is pretty interesting. So I think kind of what that's, and then also the scores, the Metacritic scores, generally like mid to low for those. So the kind of interesting finding there, I feel like, kind of suggesting that these shows, like if the budget's really high, then they just kind of push forward with the show and are not as worried about the Metacritic score or the critical reviews, which is kind of interesting. If it kind of, to me, feels like, if they have so much money invested in the show, then they're just going to keep chugging away at it. And then hopefully those critical reviews figure themselves out at some point. It's kind of the finding that I think that suggests. Another finding is that I think is very fascinating is the finished section of status of these shows, and if you notice, it is kind of what you would expect, that they are way upper percentile, and pretty well above the median for the Metacritic reviews. So these shows are very highly rated. Um, because they were finished, right? So I think that's a pretty interesting finding. The other thing with that is that and again, it's kind of fascinating, is that they are generally lower percentile for the budget. And so high critical review, low budget um, can kind of lead to a show being finished. That seems to make sense. If they're not spending that much money on it and it's getting great critical reviews, pretty good show to continue and complete. The canceled shows, a little bit all over the place with these, kind of in the middle generally, which again kind of confirms what we were talking about with the ongoing, right? The ongoing shows were high in budget, so it feels like they need to continue to push forward. But these are kind of in the middle of the budget, so they don't feel like they have that much invested. But again, kind of what we would expect. The critical reviews for canceled shows generally very low. There's a couple outliers here. Um, Shadow and Bone, kind of in the middle there. Shannara Chronicles, much higher critical review, but still canceled. So, and then here is the Wheel of Time, kind of in the middle of all that, right? I mean, it is somewhat upper budget, 64th percentile there for the budget, but then Metacritic score lower. So percentile, 28 percentile of Metacritic score. So those are some of the findings that I found kind of while just compiling this data and exploring using the dashboard. Another one, another kind of section I haven't talked about is these over here. Now, it's the same data as it's the percentile average budget here. So that's this. But what I did is I kind of compiled them together. So the canceled shows are all in here. The finished shows are in here. Ongoing shows in here. And it also kind of confirms some of those um, numbers that I was referring to, right? So the finished, we really see it here, right, with the finished. So let's go ahead and click the finish, kind of highlight that. Uh, the average percentile was 88th percentile for the finished shows on Metacritic. So that's, again, this in here, right, is that's these numbers, right? So 70, the average of 71 percentile, 85, right? So the average 87.5 percentile, and then budget 17th percentile. So I mean, the lowest of the budgets, as we can see, and on the finished shows, and then also highest on the critical reviews here. And so that is I felt like a good visual to kind of see, what the averages are of those percentiles. And then the ongoing, right? We had kind of talked about that. We see that the ongoing is high in the budget, but confirmed here, 82nd percentile, 80, almost 83 percentile for that, and then these are lower. And then the reviews middle of the road. And then we kind of again confirmed with the cancellation, right, that these would be the lowest reviewed, 32 percentile compared to 88, and this one over here with the 44. And so pretty interesting findings. I thought that was a good comparison where you kind of put all the canceled ones together, all the finished ones together, and the ongoing ones together. So that is one dashboard. I actually have another dashboard that I want to look at as well. It kind of compiles all that in one little graph. And so let's see, this is dashboard 2. Publish that so we can get the full view here. All right, so full screen. And so this is those same numbers in a pretty interesting graph, right? So if we look at it, let's look at expanse, I guess, right? So it's the um, percentile, right, or the average away from the median, not percentile, but the average percent away from the median budget here for the rows, and then the columns, we've got average percent away from the median score. So essentially, and I kind of inverted these because I wanted the kind of good section to be up top, upper right corner. And so we'll kind of take a look at that, right? This is the good section, right? So this is the finished shows. This means, Last Kingdom was the highest, since it's the furthest on the right, it was the highest Metacritic score, but also low in budget because it is up in the graph, right? It has lower budget as I kind of inverted these. So this is the good section. Okay. This is high in Metacritic score and high in budget. This is the bad section. This is the section you don't want to be in. This is high in budget, but low in Metacritic score. So again, the good section, good Metacritic score, low budget, but then the bad section over here, high budget, low Metacritic score. And so you can kind of see the finished ones are all in that good section, which is pretty interesting. Canceled ones a little bit all over the place, but it generally is in this kind of section where it's like low-ish for Metacritic score, but kind of middle of the pack on budget. And then, because again, I think it kind of suggests that the more money they have invested, the more they just want to power through. And I think that's what we see here with the ongoing ones. Rings of Power is in an interesting place. Is kind of in the canceled-ish section. Like, it's a lot of money invested. I mean, this one's a little bit of an outlier. It's a very, very expensive show, like way more expensive than anything else. The only one that even close is Foundation show, which is ongoing, but higher Metacritic as it, isn't, well, middle of the pack, at least for the whole set, but generally higher than Rings of Power. So also an interesting graph here, I think, with, all of this. And so Wheel of Time, it does tend to generally, I think, make sense. So the Wheel of Time, we'll highlight that one. That's this one right here, as we can see. And it is, I think, in that generally kind of where we would expect cancellation status show. Um, this is, it's in the bad section. And so not terribly surprising given the fact that the average Metacritic score was not that high. And then budget is kind of medium. Again, I think when the shows have high budget, they just really push forward and continue, is kind of what this data is showing here. So that is generally my dashboard, kind of the findings that I had. I have some further kind of ideas. If I were to do this project again, or have you know go for other findings. A couple of things I would do is, in regards, especially to the Wheel of Time show, the Wheel of Time was on an upward trajectory of critical review. So the first two seasons were not that highly rated. The first season was the lowest. Second season was a little bit better, and the third season was by far the highest in critical review. So, how could what if I did the same dashboard even, but as opposed to average of all the seasons, because that's what these numbers are, is the average Metacritic score or average budget for each of the seasons. What if I looked at the peak of the critical reviews, and how that affects the budget, maybe the average budget, uh, or cancellation status, or even the trajectory overall, right? The Wheel of Time has an upward trajectory of Metacritic scores. How does that affect cancellation and status of the show? I'd love to have a project looking at the viewership. That was just a very difficult number to find. Generally, just those numbers aren't published until much later. And so I think that would be really a good metric to look at, but it was very difficult to find. I could only find it for like Game of Thrones, which is a little bit older, and some of the older shows, but viewership was not published very much. Um, Another thing I could look at would be, like comparing the year, adding that as a metric, right? I mean, for each one, I didn't, all I had in the data set was the seasons. And so, and budget, right? And those other pieces that we looked at. But what is, does the year affect it, right? I mean, 2020 was a weird year. How does that affect things? Or, these ongoing shows, I mean, this is a recent period. How, maybe more success, who knows? So to potentially look at that would be another finding that we could look at. And that is my dashboard. I will publish, I can publish the link to these. And so you can, kind of manipulate these values and kind of see. But that is my data project. So thank you for listening. Take care.